Welcome to the Sales Compensation Show, where we share the latest sales performance insights through in-depth discussion with experts. Season 3 of our show is your backstage pass to discovering how today's most successful sales and revenue ops teams support go-to-market strategy and improve sales performance. Plus, we'll explore what we can learn about incentives from different industries more broadly. Subscribe to hear how leaders are unlocking new growth, implementing the latest compensation trends, and their priorities for improving go-to-market performance. I'm your host, CEO of Form AI, Nabil Alzam. Kenny Smith is a sales incentive plan design lead at Red Hat, facilitating design and implementation of global sales incentives. He has spent over a decade in sales compensation, primarily in growing enterprise software corporations. He combines sales incentive practices, corporate strategy, and analytics to create incentives, motivating associates to drive revenue growth and client satisfaction. Kenny, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the topic and the chance to talk sales comp with you.
Yeah. You and I have been on roundtables in the past, on panels, and it's been a great conversation, and every single one of those times, more on the kind of the data and the design elements. But, before we dive in and kind of nerd out on comp here, would love to just hear your story of how the heck you got into comp, right? In sales comp specifically, because you don't wake up when you're 5 years old thinking you're going to be in this space, but it's obviously compelled us both to have long careers where we are here today.
Yeah, for me, I did music performance for my college level training and finished that up and needed a way to pay rent. And so I got my teacher at the time, who was a member of the orchestra in town, to just walk me up to the offices of people who had sat at desks and did stuff. And he just kind of said, like, do you have anything for this guy? Like, he's my student and needs a job. So I got into fundraising information systems there. So donations rather than sales and purchases, but it was pretty similar in terms of you're trying to bring money into the organization. How does that happen, right? Do you get a few large donations, many small donations? So there were about a million donors or ticket buyers, either or, in the database. And so some data to work with. And I got into Visual Basic for applications, trying to automate things, and was really bad at it, but also very confident that I was good at it because it was just not a thing many people were messing with. So I would do things like basically coding a pivot table that took 40 minutes to run, and then it would be color coded and some things that normal pivot tables maybe don't do, but questionable use of time. But it got me into all of that and gave me kind of the confidence of just breaking down the problem. Like, what are the steps? What do I need to do with this data? Where am I trying to get to? And so all of that together was appealing to my next employer, who they were an enterprise software organization. And they were very insistent they were not going to buy a sales compensation tool, and discovered over the course of a few years why exactly everybody does buy something. But with a development platform themselves, they wanted to hold off on buying anything. And so they needed somebody who could manage. At the time, we had 250 payees, and they were running in Excel. And it was getting really painful to copy Excel statements out and email them to everybody and copy the managers and then keep track of the changes coming back in. And so for me, bringing the VBA perspective to that, where I could just take some of the macros that were there and automate them one step further, got me in from kind of that more operational side. Over time, I got exposed to just all things sales comp, like the systems, the process, the policy. We did have a little bit of a plan redesign project at one point. And in the end, I decided I wanted to learn more about the plan redesign, because that was the decision making. And that was what really caught my attention. Like, how do you decide to pay money to somebody for, thing A instead of thing B? And how much should it be? And what happens when you make that change?
And you're closer to the business decisions. You're closer to understanding the strategy, all the upstream go-to-market elements that impact comp. So yeah, it's
Right.
compelling part of the job and the role. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what kept me in it, was that it's a chance to really be a tourist throughout the business. You get pulled into whatever it is that's current and the latest priorities of the business. Like, how do we continually reorient to what we need to do for the next quarter, the next year? All that goes through sales comp. And I think that's, to preview the topic of data and how does it influence us and when do we pay attention to it, figuring out what matters to the business and balancing that against what do I think of best practices, what frameworks do I have to consider what's valuable or not, and then mashing that up with what's happening in reality, what the leaders really want to drive. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
constantly interesting.
Yeah. And in your current role is kind of leading plan design at Red Hat. Obviously, again, a business that has a lot of nuances in go-to-market channels and approaches. I mean, like I guess when you think about and stepping back and thinking about creating structures of incentives that align performance with the strategy of the business, I guess what's your overall plan design framework that you bring to the table? Like, how are you thinking about it today?
Yeah, I probably start with the same basics that just about everybody would use. So focusing on plan design, other people have more to do with the pay levels and the pay mix than I do, but from there it's on our side of the house. And so I think Red Hat being as big as it is, and I've been there for 3 cycles now, I definitely still feel like I'm always learning what parts of the alphabet soup mean what. So there's always new things to learn about, like, is this a reliable metric? If we have a sample of 500 people are covering this same type of client or territory, we can maybe make some really good predictions about what range of performance and expense we expect from that. If it's something brand new that we're rolling out or there's just otherwise not data, then you have to think about those metrics differently. From there, I'd walk through what metrics are being assigned and at what weight. We do have enough people and a mature enough business that we can kind of think in terms of delivering appropriate earnings for appropriate performance. We're not just looking at like a compensation cost of sales measure, like a purely finance measure. There's the balance of the finance and the more of the people perspective. From there, so we tend to really start from scratch every year. I think somebody at some point on LinkedIn had a post like, tagging a few of us, like, how often should you think about redesigning your plan? And it's like, for us, we get stuck rethinking it every year. Somebody always has some kind of feedback. And so we're always looking at what measures are in the plan and how we link those to performance. And once you have your measures sorted out, you're looking at, are any of those interdependent at all? And that can be a party, right? Because you make things interdependent and they become less predictable, really, right? Even though everyone thinks you've optimized it more by adding this dependency, it can really make pay less predictable. So I think you do that with caution, but it happens sometimes. And then from there, I think a performance range is important if you can set it, but you have to really acknowledge, especially with a business our size, we have things that are not mature at all. And then we have things that we've been selling for 2 decades now. And so the same philosophy is not going to work for all of those. And I think that's where you have to get practical about what your framework would be and back into like, what decisions do I need to make? And therefore, what data do I need to get for those? The last one where again we're just all over the place. We have some really large clients that like to throw their procurement weight around and they want to be very strategic about, only buying once a year or at the other extreme only consuming through the cloud because they don't want to be committed to anything. And so the timing of when all of that gets recognized is all over the place because you have some of those consumption clients that are pretty steady throughout the year, or you could have other consumption clients that spike whenever they need that on-demand computing. And then you have others that, they want to talk to you once every 3 to 5 years when they want to do that strategic procurement kind of an approach and you package everything, bundle it all together. And then from there, it's about making sure that they're successful with whatever they're delivering. So it kind of looks like a different comp plan for some of those. Yep. So that was a little all over the place. If I recap, like what are the most important ones? It's like what measure, what weight, are they linked? What are the mechanics? Are there mechanics that you can fine tune or do you have to kind of set it and forget it a certain percent of the top line? And then the timing of your monthly, quarterly, yearly, those sorts of decisions.
Yeah. I mean, maybe let's just, starting at the top. I think like if you think about data and what data you're going to use to both on the design side, but even the financial modeling and how, like, what insights you're going to use to figure out the direction you go. It's an important question to ask, right? Like, what data am I going to use to drive the plan design process? I'm curious to get your take on that.
The past few years, we have changed some substantial things in our metrics, like whether or not you get different levels of pay for different offerings or through different channels. We have different ways that we go to market with different partners. So some of those dynamics can be different, whether that partner is influencing a deal or purchasing something themselves or purchasing it and reselling it, and all of the ways that that can happen. So one of my rules of thumb at this point is like I get more cautious the fewer measures I have available to me, even if it appears like it's really high quality data. So like if you only have one way of getting it at a particular question, then you get less confident in your data, right? Versus I would love to have, like, if I get 5 mediocre sources of data and they're all a little messy and they're from different years or, different geos or something, but they all kind of tell a similar story, then I'm more confident at that point saying that I know something about how to design a plan. If I just have one source of data and it's like, we're big enough, we have a data science team, right? So they do some of the heavy lifting with the cleansing and things. But if we have like one data set that appears to predict a performance range perfectly, or like you can set quotas like super accurately or something, that's where it goes haywire once it becomes reality, because that data, wherever that came from, if it wasn't live data, then it's not from the same domain that you're going to use to pay people once you flip that switch and it drives their comp and they know it. And then you get to the edge cases as well, because we're big enough. We try to set a certain strategic priority, and then out of thousands of sellers, you have those handful of people where they just have no opportunity to hit a certain narrower goal than just top line bookings or contract value,
Yeah.
or recurring revenue. So I think when you think all the way through like a decision to implement something, being aware of the quality and the domain of your data, and whether it's going to truly give you a viable, fairly paying plan that impacts thousands of people, the more different kinds of data points you have, the more confident that you can get you have an actual picture.
I mean, it's funny because I feel like we're in the business of incentivizing behavior through comp, but rarely do we have access to a clean source of activity data. And that's tied to the kind of the sales process and the sales motion. So you're using other data source to try to infer whether that behavior is occurring or not, but rarely is it used like full stop as a clean data source into the sales comp process. I'm curious if you've used activity data or you've brought it in somehow in some meaningful way into your plan design processes.
Yeah, we've used it at Red Hat in some cases. So where it becomes a great measure is where there's some kind of handoff. So I was referencing pragmatism before, like one of the pragmatists who likes to stir the pot, right? Not everyone agrees with him, but he had allegedly at some point he said something in a lecture like, "Well, the truth is just whatever your colleagues are going to agree with when you say it, and whatever they let you get away with saying, that's probably the truth." And one of his colleagues from the back of the lecture hall yells out, "Maybe you're right, but I'm not gonna let you say that." And so where you have the kind of handshake where it's like from multiple perspectives, people agree that a number should be a particular number, then I think that's where you can gain some confidence with an activity measure, because it's not just the rep logging into the system, yeah, I had 5 of these meetings today. It's like where there's a process where an SDR maybe sets a meeting and then an AE has to agree to take it, and the client has to agree to take it. Something has to actually happen. Maybe an opportunity has to be logged as a result of that. It's still not necessarily perfectly correlated with, contract value or cash in the door to the company, but you become more confident in the usefulness of it, where there's that kind of a handshake of, I did something and it was useful to you. And so then it goes into the system as a metric. I think there's
I mean, you're effectively crowdsourcing the validation of the data in that way.
Right, right. Yeah, you're validating that whatever the measure is, there's some agreement to it. And I think whether it's like meetings or pipeline or training, whatever it is, like where the handshake happens, then it really helps improve the quality of the measure. At one point, there was a leader who we had these really easy new hire training MBOs. And I think a lot of companies, if they knew a new hire MBO, it's very attainable because the purpose is really the cash flow anyway, right?
Yeah.
But the leader loved the new hire MBOs because they were so easy. And he was like, if they don't do this, then I know that I should get rid of them, right? Like I have a multi-year sales cycle. I'm selling this, enterprise, like a capitalized expense. Could be 8 figures, right? It's going to take a while for them to actually close a deal, whether they're good or bad. But if they can't even like just record the company pitch deck and say like, yes, I did this, then I know that their heart isn't in it for whatever reason. Like it's just not a good fit with that rep. So that's where I love sales comp, because like I never would have thought of that. I never would have thought of giving someone something deliberately incredibly achievable and paying them a couple $1,000s for it simply because I want to know if they're not even going to bother. Right. It's a
Yeah.
interesting test.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. It's like threshold of achievement I mean, this goes back to like, oh, it's a good, I get this question all the time, like, oh, it's a good distribution of quota attainment. Well, it depends on what the quota is and what expectation of performance is for the business. And so in this case, it's like, yeah, you're setting a quota for an MBO that's just so achievable that if you don't accomplish it, I mean, that's in of itself a problem. And so again, quota distribution there is like should be 90% achieving, if not more. Otherwise, you have something off. So I mean, like, I guess, and it's a very interesting take, and I actually do agree with it in the sense of like you have validation for activities that lead to outcomes, and especially if you and I think the one perspective I'd add to that is like you'd want to get validation from people that have different incentives themselves to the overall outcome of the business, right? Like the best validation would be you have someone from customer success that says, I also believe in that metric, activity metric. I have the sales leader saying, I believe in that activity metric. I have a product manager that says, oh, yeah, that's good engagement with the customer. I believe in this metric. And if everyone believe like there, you're getting kind of all different styles of people with different incentives themselves agreeing to it, validating the process. It's hard to do, right? And I think it's kind of, I think to me, is a missing data piece in the world of comp that we're rarely using when in reality, it's kind of ultimately the thing that we're motivating is actually behavior. The sale comes as a result of the behavior. So I'm curious how you get around that. Like, are you using other types of data to better understand that where there is data gaps in behavior and kind of the way the sales force is operating?
Yeah, I think for us, mostly we are currently more biased towards paying on outcomes because in the past, I think part of being an open source organization, there needs to be a certain push and pull where it means that everybody has a lot of discretion to go off and make decisions, or at least a lot of freedom to, open source means everybody can see the source, right? Everybody knows what's happening. Nothing's, things shouldn't be secret or hidden just because it's inconvenient for people to know. Like you want to capture that feedback. But then there is a tension when you're really running a functional open source sort of organization where it's important to come back together somehow and for everyone to validate. It's like in a democracy, the idea of the loyal opposition, right? Like you didn't necessarily vote for somebody, but you're still in the country, right? You're still going to pay taxes. You're choosing to participate in the system, even though maybe you don't agree with an individual decision that affects you. So for us, we've kind of swung back towards outcomes because giving large amounts of discretion over activities tends to lead to everyone defining it their own way. And this isn't like the official Red Hat perspective on it, but I think that relates to what we were saying, that where you have the robust series of handshakes across functions and among people who don't have a financial incentive to all run the same direction, right? When they come together and agree, this rep did something valuable, that validates the activity. I think it's the more freedom you give to just go do your own thing, the tougher it is to pull back together. So I think for us, we mostly use those outcomes, and then it's also been interesting, really calibrating how much an outcome, I guess, financial sales outcome relates to value to the client in the end, right? Because clients don't want shelfware these days. They have more and more options to avoid getting stuck with it, right? And so just a booking value or maybe even just an ARR value, depending on how you define ARR, we have our own version of it. All of that may or may not strongly indicate that the client actually gets value or are they just paying for it. So I think I think this is a common thing in sales comp. Like there's the measures that are actually in the plan and then there's validating outside of the plan. There's things that you measure but don't pay on. And do those line up? Because you start to become concerned if there's things that you're measuring that are important that are not showing success, right? But then the things that you pay on are showing everything is great, then that's a sign of misalignment, whether you're paying on activities or outcomes or anything else. When you see that misalignment, that's kind of a sign that it's time to tweak the plan a bit, I think.
Yeah. And by the way, I think that is my framework because it's not necessarily a pay on activity. I think that is dangerous and has, lots of consequence and risk, but it's using activity data to kind of help you design a plan, right? And seeing those misalignments is exactly where you might need to use incentives on outcomes to course correct as an example.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
another thing that I found with data quality and informing plan design is I have a theory now that if a plan seems optimal to me, it's probably because I've overlooked something, or like I'm misunderstanding something, or I pushed too hard and bullied somebody into finalizing a decision that's not quite right. I think if you think about it, like the purpose of the organization is to deliver value to your clients rather than to optimize your sales comp plan, right? So
Yeah.
we are subordinate to the value to the client. So there's going to be things that get tweaked. I think that's part of the when you move from back and forth between so to speak the art and the science of it, like recognizing where to bend a little bit on what you think are best practices given the data that you have versus there's other factors like change fatigue in the sales force or data quality in the systems. That's that kind of last 5-10% of plan design, like really getting to something that motivates the sales force versus something that looks good on paper.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, because at the end of the day, you're right. It is a balance of art and science, and you can have all the data and tells you a beautiful story, but if you don't factor in these other elements, I mean, how do you capture that perfect balance between the art, the science, the the qualitative, the quantitative, and bring it all together to address the priorities of the business, the priorities of leadership, and ultimately, the customer?
I think it helps a lot to get on paper a more rigorous version of what we started out with, where like the decisions we are going to make are like what measures to include in the plan and why do you do that? Because they measure financial value to clients, they measure cash in our door. We're going to look at the link between pay and performance in the mechanics. Why do we do that? Because when you do the things that are in the metrics, you should get pay, right? And so you get those things on the page, and they often end up similar. Like, those of us in the function could probably write off the top of our head in 5 minutes. We'd get 90% of it. But then there could be, depending on the organization and the culture, there might be other things that come in as well. And so then you revisit that as the plan design decisions slip away from that, then you come back to that. And for me at least, like to have the opportunity to, put it in front of the leaders of all your stakeholder aspects of the organization and say, we said this is the rule. We're doing something different instead. Like, what do we all think? Does that add value to the business, or do we want to stick to the original rule? And the Miles Davis rule, my music background kicking back in. Miles, depending on which version of who's quoting him and if he even said any of this first or if he's copying somebody else, he said something like, "There's no such thing as a wrong note, only an interesting decision." Or another version is like, "No wrong notes until the next note." So really meaning like you put it into context and like so you do something happens, like does it serve what you mean to do as an organization, or are you getting pulled off track or not? And I think just
I love that. I love that framework. Well, yeah, yeah,
yeah, I like it too. I think it's a challenging thing to do. Maybe I get a little better as I get older, but like it's still challenging in the moment to like set aside my opinion and tell somebody like, "That's an interesting decision," instead of, "I think that's wrong." Because if you tell them, "I think it's wrong," like, now it's just an adversarial thing, and there's some C-level person, and I'm just, like, the sales comm plan person. I'm just, like, tracking their decision. Why am I challenging them, right? But if it's framed as, "That's interesting. Why is this valuable?" It helps to have that question, like, just memorized for me, like, to just kinda, like, chant it to myself,
yeah.
like, in the morning
I mean,
having
even
coffee before
but even the note, like the Miles Davis quote is like perfect because it really is. Sure, you can do that, and it might be wrong, but it's only wrong if you don't fix this problem, right? Like in
Yeah.
the field of comp, right? You make a change. Is there anything that's bad? Well, it depends on the business strategy, right? We may want to all of a sudden just like triple prices for all of our customers, right? Or the opposite, just discount like crazy and like go mass market approach, right? Whatever that is, that might be the right answer for the business. But the question then becomes that leader, that person that's asking for that is, okay, how are we going to address this consequence or this outcome of that decision, which then frames it up as more truly being adding value by just kind of making it clear, okay, you can play that note, but your options from there that you need to solve for or address become X, Y, and Z. And I think that is it's a very nice framework because I agree with you. There's no, especially on the music side. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think the third variation of that is, and I think Pat Metheny was the one who said this, or I saw it attributed to him, and he said something like, "Every note is something to every other note." You have some context that you're in, and you make a decision, and it relates somehow. It might or might not give you the flavor that you intended. That's really where the mastery comes in, is being able to, like, intentionally getting that flavor instead of maybe stumbling onto it and then twisting it into what you need it to be. Which, that I think, back to sales comp, I'll try and stay on topic, is when you have your guiding principles and everyone acknowledges them and says, "Yeah, we wanna do these things. We wanna link value to the organization, to the rep's pay, and so forth." And then when you have something that steps away from that, and when you say it, "Oh, it's okay this year," right? And then when the next year you come back to it, sometimes I don't even have to track it. It just bothers me for a year, and then I can't help myself, like, raising the same question again. But you come back to it and you say, like, "We made this decision again. Like, we ratified that, like, we're gonna continue stepping away from these guiding principles that we have, that we've already been tailoring to our organization." And so then that's a sign, either, like, there's not the organizational will to change, which could be okay. Like, you don't have to make sales comp optimal. Like, the business as a whole should be optimizing. Or it could be there's some nuance that's just not captured in the guiding principles. Like, one of my favorite examples, I worked on a project where there was a job that was a junior, kind of a technical pre-sales job. And they were pulling people, like, right out of school. I forget what kind of engineering background they wanted, but, if you're an engineer, even fresh out of undergrad, you could be making much more than if you had, say, like, a business or marketing degree. And the career progression is different, right? You start higher in one place, but then you have less variation over time. And so there's a different appetite for variable incentive pay. And so they said, like, "We don't pay any of these people incentives until they're exceeding their goal," right? So half of their people wouldn't be getting an incentive payout. So that's kind of broken compared to the usual principle, where
Yep.
you want incremental pay for incremental results, even for your lower core performers. But they had made an intentional decision, like, we can't recruit these people in the first place if we don't give them something that's a reasonably livable wage compared to their opportunities if they were on the engineering side of the organization. Like, that's just the talent that we need. And so I thought that was a great example, where it's like, we're violating a principle, but because there's kind of a sub bullet here that explains why this is valuable to the organization.
Yeah, I do agree. Like the music analogies are great because it's like there's so many moving variables in comp. I mean, you're effectively, again, the larger the organization, the more rules, the more nuances, and they all meshes together, right? It is a harmony. Like, you're playing all these notes at the same time, and if there's one note off, the whole thing kind of starts to, fall apart or sounds off, right? And I'm curious, kind of just bringing back that kind of art and science. Has there been times, or give an example where you've had to use your intuition about that note being off, even though maybe there wasn't data, there wasn't anything that was kind of immediately obvious that that wasn't the right play?
That's a good question. I mean, probably. I'm not sure that I can categorize those as well, just because the instinct, just like the something doesn't quite smell right here kind of aspect of it, is by its nature tough to pin down. I actually had a thought, though, like, the art and science piece, because I had a professor at one point on the business side who made the point, like, if there were a single right way of doing everything, then somebody would be doing it already, right? So somebody would already be running that company, and there would be no risk to it, right? You make money in business as an investor by intelligently assuming risk, and then capturing, the upside there turned out to be more than the risk. So if there's no uncertainty, if there's no difference in, two different ways to go about something that both work and both make money, then there's just not really a profitable company there, unless maybe it's a monopoly of some kind. And I think that's very similar to the way things work in the arts, where if something were just, like, purely adhering to the platonic ideal definition of something, there would be no interest in it. There wouldn't really be any sort of, anything to catch your ear or your eye, or to get you thinking about a story. That was one of the things that I always felt was relatable, like music theory versus sales compensation. You have to, like, there will be a theme of some kind, but you have to sort through the mess to find it. There's gonna be, reality at the edges tugging at it. In any sort of, performance, or, theory class doing analysis with music, the most interesting thing is there's a flaw that's in there that's interesting in some way. And I think there's a lot of that in sales compensation where, especially if you're on the finance side, you get influenced by the finance mindset is going to be like, we have to manage how expenses look relative to revenues, right? They're not thinking as much about, like, they're not as close to, there's a client who really wants something that we could give them, but we haven't done it before. And this could be a great opportunity for us, but it's like, it's a stretch. Do we take that risk or not, right? That's the sales side and the sales mindset. And we get stuck in the middle facilitating those two mindsets agreeing on something. So you get that tension there. And I think that's where instinct comes in, that you may not be able to, push a CRO or a CFO to make one decision or another, but as the facilitator bringing them together, you can kind of help to create that discussion where they can hopefully agree on something.
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree. And I think again, the kind of the art element. I mean, in sales comp, when you're making a bigger change, when you're trying to disrupt the behavior, there is the element of, too little, it's not going to drive enough behavior. Too much, you're going to create too much of a disruption and adverse reaction in the organization. And there's this element of, you want to be provocative, but just the right level of provocative, and it is a balance. I mean, that's to me the art element of it. The data can tell you a story, but how you action on it, how you capture it, and kind of like back to kind of that gut feel or instinctive nature of, I mean, the role is designed in such a way where you talk to sellers on a regular basis, right? Like you are getting that feedback, and you're getting feedback with regards to comp, and so you're digesting this information, you're integrating it all into kind of this, what ends up becoming this kind of gut reaction of this gut feel. And, but yeah, bringing the leaders together, having that dialogue happen. And yeah, I certainly agree. So on the topic of kind of bringing these stakeholders together, how are you using data to overcome some of the, when I would say again, the emotional or kind of like the bought in biases, or the confirmation bias of their past experience aside, so that you can get to the right outcome?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most challenging ones, and it can be really delicate. Like, nothing is more dangerous than somebody who saw something work really well at a previous organization. They're like, when they've been at a previous organization for, 10 or 15 years and then they move, and especially if it's an organization that you respect as a competitor, or, some kind of just a well-run company, that temptation to try and put on Michael Jordan's shoes and dunk is like too much to resist sometimes. I think some of the time there are some leaders that really just need to, like, try something and see how it goes and see if it falls apart on them or not. And for that kind of a culture, like being able to pilot something as maybe a special incentive can be really helpful. Like, you do something that is more limited in terms of the outcome that it targets or the range of potential payout. You just say like, hey, we'll give you $10,000 if you do this, instead of, we're gonna add this quota that could pay you like 500,000, and then you get it wrong, and like you do, at that point you have to pay them. Or are you really gonna?
100%, 100%. Yeah, exactly. Can you limit your risk in that test or that experiment? Which is, yes.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I think that the test is really important. I think just keeping the guiding principles in view is important, so that you can say, like, are we in the domain here of things that we've tested before and that we think work, or are we stretching? If we're stretching, why are we confident to do that?
I mean,
And
actually, you touched on something that's interesting, the before part, right? Like, I've rarely seen like an organization keep track of like like an audit, or very easily accessible. Like, these are all the possible comp plans we've ever worked with and tried in the past decade. But on average, the role of a sales comp leader is definitely not a decade, right? Like, it's, especially because it's, you get promoted through, even so you might not even been in a position where you've seen all the comp plans across the globe, even if you were at the company for 10 years. But I don't know, is that something that, like, you know, as a sales company, it's like, are you keeping track of that? Are you thinking about that? Like, how are you benchmarking against, oh, we've done this before?
yeah, I'm lucky to work with other people who have some of that institutional knowledge of Red Hat, and I think that's part of joining a new organization. Yeah, I mean, I'm a few years in, but still always kind of looking at, if somebody's nervous about something, then like, give them this space to kind of air that out and describe it. I think that's the most difficult part of becoming. There's, the phrase like strategic or trusted advisor is kind of like a popular aspiration in our function, right? I think that there's a temptation when you're more breaking into that, or when you're, like, aspiring to it, to come, like, really armed with the data and, like, correlations of this and that. And often I think senior leaders who are the ones who have the final say, like they don't really have the time to get into like the R squared or whatever. They just kind of like they read about something in Gartner or like McKinsey Quarterly or whatever, and like they want to go that direction, you know? And so having the framework and the guiding principles to go back to and say, like, is this what we agreed was the right direction or not? That helps. And being able to go back to that question of like, this is interesting and not typical, and why is this valuable for us to to do this? Like, it's not bad that it's atypical. It could make us unique. It could be a big advantage. And I think that, the people who get to that level of being able to successfully influence, they become really skilled at understanding, like, is this conversation going to be about making the decision, or maybe it's important for somebody to kind of vent a little bit about the problem that they're facing in their part of the organization, and then after a half hour of that meeting, like, do we arrive at like, so what are our options here? Like, is this an incentives problem? Is it a performance management problem? Is it a dashboard reporting problem? There's, incentives is not necessarily the only way to solve any of these. And I just think it's the people that I have seen acquire the most influence often are, and they come off as being sort of the most intellectually generous as well. They let other people talk in the meeting, and they're not going to talk over you and everything, but it takes it takes the stature to do that, right? If I just join a meeting with a CFO who's never met me before, right, am I going to be in a position to let them talk and then say like two sentences that totally change their mind? Maybe not. So I guess maybe part of that answer is, if you can partner with a senior leader who does understand your perspective and you trust them to kind of referee, right? And, you follow their lead. If they're going to say like, this is just too expensive, or like, this doesn't motivate the sales force enough, like, you kind of have to be willing to take some of that feedback some of the time. Because I think our greatest power is to just convene those C-level stakeholders who are actually going to make the calls, and to try and convene them in a productive way. And it might produce what I want, it might not, but that's kind of part of the job.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's if you can get the data and you can get the story across in a way where you can get them to understand it tactically, then obviously, they're in that role for a reason. They've seen things, whether in that company or beyond. And so now you're kind of that kind of, and they have a bigger purview of the organization, right? And whether it's their organization or others that are obviously like finance, for example. And so if you can get that understanding elevated up and done in a succinct, clear way, then kind of that feedback back is valuable, because whether, they bought it or not, it's a learning lesson for whether, again, back to your point, updating guiding principles, changing the framework of how you analyze, maybe the data's off, et cetera.
There's a phenomenon where some of the time an organization is convinced it has a problem, and it's actually that's the thing that kind of makes the business work in a unique way. And it's just performance range is a big one. I at one point working for a software company that was selling digital transformation type stuff, like huge investment, and so we had reps who just weren't even getting on the board year to year. But then if they're on track for once every 3 years they sell 8 figures of stuff, then like you take that's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not wrong that you don't have this predictable perfect bell curve if your results are more of a power law and you can't predict what's going to hit in a particular year. So
Yeah, 100%. Again, it's the nuances, and the it depends answer is kind of quite common. We touched a little bit on this around like the being a strategic advisor. How do you think about collaborating with all these different roles? Like, you mentioned the CFO, the finance, sales, there's, a product management even in some organizations in terms of how it touches the customer. Like, how are you orchestrating, collaborating across all these different stakeholders when you're thinking about sales comp design?
yeah, I think, and maybe this is a personality type thing, but one thing I took from music school, I got very into the idea of like, what kind of artistic statement am I trying to make, or am I using some kind of like flashy technique or whatever. And my one teacher was like, you gotta just sync every single putt. Like, you have to be the reliable person that everyone wants to work with. And so I think there's just kind of some value in that in the business world as well. Like, just, you don't have to have the entire answer to every email within 24 hours, but like, acknowledging people's concerns is helpful. And if you can't, like, if you get so swamped that you're not going to get to it, then like, what is the plan at that point? Like, who covers for you? Is there some other point person who can help? And yeah, I think Like it's another version of sync the putts. So the same teacher, clearly he had a theme that he was trying to get across to me that I wasn't getting right. He loved all of these quotes. And so he told me there's no such thing as an advanced technique. There's only just basic technique well applied. And so then I told that to one of my students, and this kid is like, that's Chuck Norris. Why are you quoting Chuck Norris in my trumpet lesson? But I think that's also true, like listening skills being like the one that comes to mind. I think that's the most prominent. Like if you become trusted as a person where like you can join a meeting and you're gonna have notes that everyone agrees afterwards that it's accurate, that it captures what people want and what was decided, that's really, really powerful. And sometimes that's like kind of all you can do if you're meeting with somebody who's not in your function and you don't understand it yet. Like you need to learn their language and, take the notes from them on how to describe something and what the priorities are. And so, yeah, I think, it's not flashy, like it'd be nice if there was some kind of like secret deck, how like on LinkedIn, people are like, this is what I used in McKinsey. I don't really have anything exactly like that. I think if you become really, really good at listening and it's a continual thing, like for me, my day I spent today, I didn't really have any meetings. So I'm like super talkative now. So it's a thing that you have to moment really even regulate. I'm an introverted person, but if you give me a chance to talk, then I run with it. Right. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think your feedback or your answer is spot on. Like, there's not okay, just press here and you're going to execute well, right? I think it's funny because we say something different form, which is like, and you do the little things well and everything else takes care of itself. Like, you can't sacrifice on the quality of any one thing. Otherwise, it just cascades up the chain. And I think, your point on like coming in, you're talking to all different types of stakeholders. It's both, the best part of comp, and it's also the most challenging, right? Because everyone has different challenges, different problems, different set of priorities. It's not, when it's the most priority for you, it's not the most priority for them, and vice versa. And no single person knows how much is on your plate, to your point, and what's happening and the issues. And so, because anyone growing in this field, like when I first had like first time in this kind of role where you're getting emails from reps, you're getting emails from sales managers, you're getting emails from finance, and hey, what's this delta in the accrual? And you have to orchestrate, manage all that. I mean, the best way to do it is to your point, tackle it responsibly. I love that. You have to sink every pot. I'm like, it's true. You got to like be that reliable person, and then over time, the more that you learn, the more you understand about the business, the more that you can become that trusted advisor because you just trust it as being reliable and you have the information. The more you're given the opportunity to kind of speak up, and then that
Yeah.
to kind of step up and share your perspective and insights. And but yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think it turns into not just in the meeting listening skills, but like strategically, like giving people the chance, like giving them a project plan or a schedule of meetings and which decisions are we going to try and make when, a communication plan for once you roll out, like what sessions are we going to have, when is the purpose to get feedback or to tell everyone how everything's going to work. Just having everyone know that there's the structure to the feedback and the input helps to avoid getting swamped. It's easy to get swamped. You have an entire sales force and they all want more money. They're all going to send you questions.
yeah, 100%, 100%. And I guess like on the premise of like there is no perfect tool, there's no button, but are there some tools that you do recommend when you think about like whether it's a framework or a tool that's not, necessary, it's more of like an approach that has helped you in the design process or even just kind of again executing on kind of this all the project management associated with managing these.
Yeah, there is a kind of a unifying thing, I think, or at least it was for me, it was a light bulb moment. And it had the feel of the back to basics thing. It was also a moment of like, well, I guess I it's a good thing I can figure out math even though I went to music school. Like I'm not the best at it, but I'll suffer through it. But I think to understand that the organization, the sales force has a supply and a demand curve with whatever result that you're asking them to bring in, and then whatever the organization is willing to pay, and to think about the incentives that way. Like the more you know about the supply curve and the demand curve for revenue or bookings value or margin or whatever, then the more you know about that, the more you can calibrate your incentives. And so that starts to inform, like, should we have, accelerators at some level, and how much should we accelerate, or should they taper off because beyond some point, maybe the data is not as reliable. Maybe they're influencing term lengths or something and creating, artificially inflated numbers. Or is it a case where we should continue paying? So thinking about the supply and demand curve there, not necessarily to do the math, but like as a concept that as it gets harder to bring in a deal, the reps are going to demand more. And that's, I think, tells you something about compensation cost of sale. I think if there were a single like magic button to press to make sales comp better, it'd be like everybody understands how CCOS works. Like press that button, and then I think you'd have a lot more agreement across like sales and finance. Like for finance to understand that, you pay the base salary once, and then from there, as you sell, if you could sell infinitely more, than the base salary would be like 0% of your, or nearly 0%, right? It would approach 0% of your payouts. And so you have the room, you can afford to do the accelerators. And then for the sellers to understand, like from their perspective, if there is some kind of a tapering mechanism, or like nobody loves a cap, but there are cases where it becomes that interesting decision that fits somehow, and the organization puts one in place, understanding what that data looks like and what goes into what the rep is supplying to the organization, I think would help as well. So I know I think it's tough to incorporate, but like one way to do it, if you don't have necessarily live data, you can look at, if we fake something up, if we just look at an incentive plan that has like the median quota, and we look at our pay curve and we say like over this range, up to quota, what's the range of our CCOS? And then like over quota, what's our CCOS look like out to some performance level. I think it's not exactly like a magic secret button, because I think it takes more education than to just say the top 10% of our reps hit 200% of the quota. Like that's really simple.
No,
CCOS takes more. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, there's at the end of the day, sales comp is an optimization problem, right? So it's like you play one lever over here, you're going to spend a little bit more over here, but then what's the consequence over here? And the complexity, the reason why it's complex to get that alignment, or we've seen from everyone around the table, is that it's actually across the board. You kind of have this, there's a ton of variables, and there's a lot of things that need to be factored in when you're creating and optimizing these plans. I mean, yeah, I could spend a whole hour talking about this part of this.
Yeah. From your perspective, actually, because I know you have the advantage of having worked with a variety of clients, and I'm, sitting at one organization thinking about that. Like, are there things that you feel like organizations are just missing in terms of understanding how their plans work, given that you have more of the data and the analytical tools there?
Yeah, I think the biggest, you touched on it there, which is why I'm saying it's such an intriguing topic for me, because it's like the biggest gap that I see is the sensitivity analysis of, if we do more of, if we nudge their sales team to do more of X, what's the consequence to something else? Because that is ultimately what you're doing in sales comp, right? You're optimizing. You have this kind of like very complex, multidimensional space of, different behaviors will result in different business outcomes, and across a bunch of different metrics: revenue, margin, customer satisfaction, et cetera, et cetera. And so then you think about, okay, well, the more that you want to optimize for, the more things that you want to kind of solve for, the harder it is for you to understand what impact focusing on one leads to another. But if organizations I've seen do this very, very well, and that kind of leverage the best in class, like analytics for some of our customers, it's like there's a very clear mapping of, the more we allocate to this metric, the more we're going to take a hit here. So when you're designing your comp plans and your pay curves, now I know if we pay any more for margin dollars in this metric, then X percent, we are now going to risk some weird discounting behaviors. Why do
Yeah.
you know that? Because the marginal response to that behavior from the sales team beyond a certain point takes over the earnings that you'd make from just focusing on revenue, right? And like, I rarely have I seen organizations truly take a pragmatic approach to that, where it's like, okay, this is the impact of over focusing here versus here. But if you do, and people understand it, which is the hard part, right? Because like now you think about all these different like correlations that you need to understand in the back of your mind while you're thinking about the plan design?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. So being in Chicago, where Chicago has a really strong behavioral economics program, like sometimes I run into people where they're coming out of school and they're like really psyched about applying that, and they're really interested in sales comp because it's got behavioral economics flavor to it. And they want to learn from like those of us in industry. And I was like those of us in industry have no idea, like we don't understand any of this stuff, all of this game theory and everything. But that would be interesting to see as more organizations are adopting the AI tools where you could have it doing a ride along, and it figures out things that you didn't even know to tell it to try to figure out. I think we're big enough and old enough and complicated enough that if we tried to really represent everything that we want to represent in the comp plan, it stretches to the point where just everybody's brain hurts. And I can't keep track of this monster that I'm supposed to be documenting, and let alone, like, are the reps acting rationally on it? And I don't mean that to sound like I don't think that they can understand it, because often they know so much more detail about their specific territory that they can optimize it way better than I anticipated.
100%.
And so that's an interesting one where, I think there may be some updates to that concept of, if you have guiding principles and you stretch away from it, why and who gets to decide that, and what approvals are needed or anything, like to be guided by a machine system that can notice that we introduced this new logo thing or whatever it is, and now the reps started churning clients so that they can win them back as new logos, like those kinds of things.
100%. And if you think about the amount of data that you have, right? I mean, like this is what I saw when I was in consulting, helping organizations in comp, and then kind of left to do this. The whole premise behind it was like, you could, if you had an infinite amount of human resources, go back, take a look at every plan an enterprise rolled out in the last 20 years and map out like cause and effect at a rep level and create this map that I'm talking about, right? This kind of like utility function is effectively what you're doing. And you're kind of creating this map of like, hey, these types of behaviors lead to more of this, but at a cost of X. Where's the perfect balance of what you want based off of the objectives that you have in your organization? So I saw this. I'm like, you could, in theory, do this with an infinite number of humans. Well, okay, the ROI then doesn't make sense if you spend more than a certain amount of human hours to uncover, X percent incremental revenue opportunity. But if at the time, and this is 2015, right before I found a formula, machine learning was really becoming like, okay, this is a real application of technology where you can uncover these insights without infinite humans. Certainly there's a compute cost, but it's now you're preserving these insights to a human being to distill and decipher at the insight level, not go through hundreds of thousands of hours of computation to figure out and uncover. And so that's ultimately the whole vision behind what we're building is like, okay, well, to do that, you need a consistent language of comp so that you can then process all that data through this recommendation engine. But
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, that reminds me, you were asking before about, instincts, and when does something raise, an instinct that something is off somewhere and I don't know what it is. I did think of a moment just now. So I have this suspicion that the more closely you define a measure to what somebody can influence, the wider the resulting performance range is going to be, because you are measuring then truly what varies, right? So you would expect there to be more variation. It's kind of a common sense thing, but you see it, for instance, like if you measure incremental recurring revenue versus gross recurring revenue, something like that, you would have to start setting a very narrow performance range for something that is like the gross number and doesn't move as much, right? What the rep can really influence is the growth, and could relate to like a behavioral economics thing of, does somebody understand, is it manageable to communicate to them what their growth is and what the baseline is, and why, do you tweak it a certain bit to account for fluctuation over time? Can be really pretty complicated. But I think, to me, when the performance range starts to get super narrow, that's a sign that it's a time to change what the metric is, and then maybe you don't quite understand what the job of that role is. Like I had at one point a sales leader describing, he had route-based sellers, so they're usually on the same route every week. Like their sales should usually be the same. So we were asking him because he was just pushing for narrower and narrower ranges, and he's like, you know what? at 100% of their quota, like, yeah, they're a core performer, of course. And then at 101%, they're pretty good. At 102, they're great. Like if they hit 105% of their quota, they're committing fraud somehow. And that's too narrow of a measure. Like then your CCOS math, for instance, stops making sense. Like your willingness to pay at that steep of a payout curve, if somebody hits 105% and they're getting like 200+% of their target incentive, like that's a sign that, there's something not calibrated right, I think, in that measure.
Yeah,
So
unless you have like, literally 18-month out forecasts with accuracy levels that are like through the roof. Cause yeah, I mean, I've seen it in certain industries where, yeah, 100, like that range is very narrow, but it's very specific industries where you can predict customer consumption at a very accurate level years in advance. And so, but yeah, I hope, yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, that is a good kind of one where you have to use your gut a little bit to kind of get a sense of like what is a reasonable constraint,
yeah.
plus or minus, for sure.
Yeah, and you're kind of stuck with your gut there because, at least for me in that case, it was like, I don't know exactly what this person's real job is, but it's not driving the level of gross sales. Like maybe it's the growth or maybe it's the retention or something, but that was not a case where I would believe that the primary job was selling.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so at this point, I'd love to do a segment with you that we're calling SPM Mythbusters.
Okay.
So the whole premise behind is this is an opportunity for us to really debunk common myths about sales performance management. And how it's going to work is I'll throw out a myth and get your perspective on whether it's true, false, or somewhere in between. But
Okay.
let me know if you're good. I can.
Yeah, I like to stir the pot a little bit. We'll see if I manage to.
Yeah, the more provocative, the better. So, okay, myth one: more data always equals better outcomes or better decisions.
Yeah, not at all, because I think, like we were covering before, as you get more data, that's a sign that something is becoming better understood and better predictable. And I think often the point of a sales incentive plan is to motivate the reps to push into new territories where there's less data. So, it could be a sign that your business is maturing, or it could be a sign that you're just not taking as much risk as you could.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, exactly. It's not 100% true, right? There's an
Yeah.
like, yeah. There's always edge cases. Okay, comp plans should 100% be or should be 100% data driven.
I think again, like very similar, that it depends. If you have the data, then it should be substantially data driven. But the less data you have, the less data driven it should be. Because at that point, you're talking about your aspirations as an organization. You might be driven more by things like your head count rather than your existing client base if you don't have a client base. So.
Yep. Okay. Back to kind of the adage of like more incentives, better performance.
I think more incentives means more performance for what you're measuring, but where you are over indexing, you could be paying for something that you don't want. Like you could be paying for bringing in unprofitable customers, or you could be paying for people to create bank accounts that nobody signed up for, or whatever it is. Like you'll get what you're measuring, but it might not be what you want.
Yeah, 100%. And then plan design cycles should be done once a year.
You know, I feel like I don't know if I could do more than one a year the way we do it, but I think you bucket. Like, is this a change that we want to make once a year, or is it something tactical? You can bring in a spiff more often, a special incentive, but I think there is some value to committing for a year, and then especially if you're in an industry where you have a multi-year sales cycle anyway, pulling the rug out from them every year is only counterproductive when somebody's trying to close a 2-year long deal, but they don't know what their comp plan is going to be 2 years out.
Yeah. Yeah, I really think that one is like 100%. It's like relevant to the deal size, the deal length, the sales motion. It could be month to month that you do new plans, but again, it's very relevant. Individualization of plans is
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I think Red Hat in the past was skewing towards this. We had at one point, I think it was 500 different incentive plans, or at the time, maybe it was 4,000, 4,500 reps. When I was about to join the organization, and I was getting kind of some of the backstory, and the hiring manager was saying, well, we had 500, now it's down to like 150, and we want to continue kind of unifying, and kind of asked, so what would you do, if you were part of an organization that was trying to rationalize incentive plans? And I just said, like, first, I need to pick the brain of whoever got you from 500 to 100. Like, what was that backstory? So I think individualization, I think it really depends why you're doing it and what governance you have over how the plan varies as it becomes that specialized. It could make a lot of sense. Like if you have like one account executive role and some of them have nothing but greenfield and then others have like mostly existing customers, or maybe I heard the term brownfield one time for like a client that's not satisfied and you bring them back. There, I think some individualization could make sense, but then I think your analysis of things like the CCOS and everything else that we were discussing has to somehow cover how that variation works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the framework that I've seen and work well and is really the premise. Like, I think when we say individualization, it's not necessarily individualized plans for the sake of individualizing plans for each person. It's, ideally it's individualizing for a selling role and the nuances within each territory. So it's less about the human being and individualizing for, that person, but it's individualizing for the nuances. And so to your point, it's like if one territory is over indexed here, which in theory you are doing if you have quotas that are set based off of the dynamics of the territory. That is one form of individualization. But, the other form is like you factor in that, hey, this rep has pipeline that may spill into next year. And so we want to think about, you know, how do we accelerate that? How do we make that work based off of the customer base, based off how the customers are buying? And so that to me is where it becomes, a little bit of a question, like how much can you do that without making it more complex and actually less rewarding? But
Right. Yeah, I don't to my knowledge, this was not implemented, but I thought it was a really interesting idea. There was at one point a proposal at a different organization that the account executives would bid for their accounts. So, like, if you want a really good account, you'd say, "Yeah, I'll take, a $5 million for quota for that one." Or there's, like, the dead account that nobody wants goes for, like, 250K, and then it just drops out of coverage maybe because, why would you pay for that, to have somebody with an OTE of like 300K covering an account that's so that would be pretty radical with the
yeah, I
individuals.
mean, that's it's an interesting approach. You'd have to somehow apply a weighting for prior historical performance because you would want the weight of that quota that they're taking credit for being tied to like how they've been able to accomplish quota in the past. So now if it's a 90% quota attainer, they have to bid 6 million or 5 million, 500K. And then that versus the rep that's always hit quota every year for the last 3 years at 100%. Right. So that it kind of balances it up. I think it's it's a very interesting concept. And
I think you
yeah,
need
so
to
yeah, now you're creating customer disruption in terms of relationships and all the, everything else that comes along with that. It's been amazing having, like, I think we've just kind of covered so much ground on a bunch of different topics. I could spend a couple more hours talking about sales comp and all the stuff we're talking about, but the show has to come to an end. And I always ask two closing questions. So first, in the world of sales performance management or sales compensation, who would you most like to take out to lunch and what would you talk about?
Yeah, so I think it would be cool to have kind of a round table, sort of a thing, and to have some people like I think Maria Ozko-Canant was on the podcast and on the show. I thought she had a lot of interesting ideas about how to manage all of the like the more fast paced small organization stuff where if you're really trying to supercharge dramatic growth, you have to be a lot more responsive than a large organization can be. And I think it's just interesting, like, currently being in a large organization, having been in some smaller ones, like, there's an assumption that large organizations have so many resources that we can just dive into, like, whatever crazy machine learning thing, and then some of the time, what we're actually doing is trying to get from 500 plans down to 100 so we can keep track of them? So I think that would be interesting. I did actually get to have lunch after, a World at Work session with Nina Ostrom from Akamai,
Yeah.
and she was an example of that sort of leader who's seen a lot, I think, and, it is, like, still on the kind of the cutting edge of how the software industry is thinking about sales comp and adjusting to changing times.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a small world because clearly you end up knowing and hearing about and kind of seeing and interacting with everyone in the space. But second question and final question: what sales performance, or sales comp book? It doesn't even have to be in the space. I always ask, like, would you recommend to the audience? But really, it could be like a book that's helped you or a resource that's helped you improve or think about sales compensation differently.
So I don't read too much in the sales comp space, like end to end. I think Christopher Goff's book was an interesting topic, like the idea of like how do we find and create fairness in sales incentive plans. I can't say I've sat down and read it, but I joined some of his talks at that same World at Work iteration, and I think he has some interesting ideas. I think also a book that I have read that I wouldn't necessarily inflict on anybody is my big pragmatism read was John Dewey, Logic, the Theory of Inquiry. And so that helped to really put in place, like he has such a broad definition of what that might be. And it covers all of these cases where, you might have a lot of data, you might have no data, you might only know what you want to know, or you might know what you want to achieve, but not how to get there. Or maybe you have some kind of tool that you can use, but you don't know yet what it gets you when you apply it. So that book and The Pragmatists in general, I think, helped, because with business school, there's this part of the end of every chapter of every textbook. It feels like it gets to this point where something like, well, if you really wanted to properly value this investment opportunity, you would do a DCF, and you'd look at like different methods and different like adjusted beta, and you'd look at all, but people just do market multiples, but you shouldn't, because you should do it the right way. And so every function has this version of it. Like you should really do it the proper way. Come on, MBA student. And in real life, like most of the time we throw it out, because most of the time you need to get a directionally right answer. And you have to choose, when do I really need a great answer? And I think that's where pragmatism is kind of orienting.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Great recommendations.
If I try a one-sentence summary of that book, it's that you begin inquiry when you realize that you were confused about something that you care about. And then you finish your inquiry when you decide what to do about it. And it's provisional. You can always come back and change your mind. But when you're conducting inquiry, it's about settling what some action should be. And if there's no action that you're going to take, then it's just not a live question, which I think is helpful when you're buried in data. If you work backwards from what would this change if I got a certain answer, and if there's nothing that would change, then there's no live question.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Well, Kenny, this has been like great. I think we've covered a ton of stuff, and thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Nabil. It's been a pleasure to talk through with you, and I appreciate the suggestion of the topic. Hopefully I had some good sound bites in there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love music analogies. Absolutely. The Sales Compensation Show is brought to you by Forma AI, the sales performance management platform that fully integrates sales planning with rapid, scalable incentive compensation management. Our data platform brings together how you can plan and manage the entire lifecycle of territories, quotas, and incentives. With global customers like Autodesk, Stryker, and Hootsuite, we enable go-to-market teams to plan and deploy even the most complex SPM strategies at speed, taking you from idea to execution instantly. To learn more about Forma AI, visit our website at forma.ai. Hit the subscribe button and find more episodes of the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in.